Peace be up on you. My name is Johann Tree. This is far as I can tell, episode 16. We're going to call this Setting the Stage. The world Jesus was born into. And this is going to come from paper 121. And that's entitled The Times of Michael's Bestowal. Yeah, setting the stage. This is kind of like when a trilogy come on, you know what I mean? A movie with a whole lot of backstory and whatnot. And they got them words on the screen just coming down, setting it up. That's what this is. So again, it's from paper 121, The Times of Michael's Bestowal. And I'm going to start it off. Acting under the supervision of a commission of 12 members of the United Brotherhood of Urantia Midwayers, conjointly sponsored by the presiding head of our order and the Melchizedek of record, I am the secondary midwayer of one-time attachment to the Apostle Andrew. I had to laugh because, I know we haven't gone over a lot of this. We've talked about midwayers before. I just laugh because of how real this is and how real this is about to get. But this whole narrative, what he's saying is Jesus had 12 apostles, and one of them was Andrew. That was like, Andrew was the manager in a sense. And this is, I've referred to midwayers before as a creature midway between spirit and flesh. And they're closer to us than angels. And some people have midwayers kind of assigned to their custody. And this particular midwayer was Andrew's midwayer, and he's the one responsible for what we're about to hear. I am the secondary midway of one-time attachment to the Apostle Andrew, and I am authorized to place on record the narrative of the life transactions of Jesus of Nazareth as they were observed by my order of earth creatures, and as they were subsequently partially recorded by the human subject of my temporal guardianship. Knowing how his master so scrupulously avoided leaving written records behind him, Andrew steadfastly refused to multiply copies of his written narrative. A similar attitude on the part of the other apostles of Jesus greatly delayed the writing of the Gospels. In the last episode, Jesus had mandates about this bestowal. He had parameters he had to stay within. One of the things he was told not to do was leave any written records behind him. He was not to personally leave anything that was written on like a permanent material. And the reason being is because they don't want man to end up idolizing that or, venerating it and worshiping that, because that's not what his mission was about. So not only did he not leave records behind, written records, he told his apostles, like, don't write this down. Don't write this down. We're living a life. So that was the opening paragraph. Part 1, this says, the Occident of the first century after Christ. And again, you know how I do, like sometimes I gotta skip around. I'm gonna try to, stick to a lot of the major parts. But this is part 1. The Occident that's a term for the Western world. And they're saying after Christ because, I can just tell you ahead of time what they're doing is pretty much describing the soil that this mission was planted in. So the Occident of the first century after Christ, and said Jesus did not come to this world during an age of spiritual decadence. At the time of his birth, Urantia was experiencing such a revival of spiritual thinking and religious living as it had not known in all its previous post-Adamic history, nor has it experienced in any era since. Again, if you've been with me, you know we went over Adam and Eve, and that was like 30 something thousand years before Michael came down here. So they're saying in those 30,000 years, that intervening time, I mean, spirituality had really reached a real low. And up until this particular time, when Christ finally came here, there was like a spiritual rejuvenation taking place. And they're going to describe why. When Michael incarnated on Urantia, the world presented the most favorable condition for the Creator's Son's bestowal that had ever previously prevailed or has since obtained. In the centuries just prior to these times, Greek culture and the Greek language had spread over Occident and Near Orient, and the Jews, being a Levantine race, in nature part Occidental and part Oriental, were eminently fitted to utilize such cultural and linguistic settings for the effective spread of a new religion to both East and West. So they're alluding to basically Greek culture and language had taken a foothold in this Eastern Mediterranean area. And that was one of the things that helped the gospel sort of spread so fast afterwards. And the Jews being a Levantine race, that's their area, you know, the Levant, that's their area of like Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. This entire combination of world influences is well illustrated by the activities of Paul, who, being in religious culture a Hebrew of the Hebrews, proclaimed the gospel of a Jewish Messiah in the Greek tongue while he himself was a Roman citizen. So that's saying a lot. They're telling you how much was going on at the time. This was the beginning of the Roman Empire. Paul was a Roman citizen, but he spoke Greek and he was actually a Hebrew. So that's like a lot going on, you know what I mean? And that's ripe for spreading something, all these particular influences. Nothing like the civilization of the times of Jesus has been seen in the Occident before or since those days. European civilization was unified and coordinated under an extraordinary threefold influence. The Roman political and social systems. 2, the Grecian language and culture and philosophy to a certain extent. Grecian, Greek for those who don't know. 3, the rapidly spreading influence of Jewish religious and moral teachings. So this is the threefold major influence that was taking place at Jesus's time, during Michael's time on earth. But so that's 1, the Roman political and social systems. 2, the Greek language and culture and philosophy to a certain extent. And 3, the spreading influence of Jewish religious and moral teachings. When Jesus was born, the entire Mediterranean world was a unified empire. Good roads, for the first time in the world's history, interconnected many major centers. The seas were cleared of pirates, and a great era of trade and travel was rapidly advancing. Europe did not again enjoy another such period of travel and trade until the 19th century after Christ. Notwithstanding the internal peace and superficial prosperity of the Greco-Roman world, a majority of the inhabitants of the empire languished in squalor and poverty. The small upper class was rich. A miserable and impoverished lower class embraced the rank and file of humanity. There was no happy and prosperous middle class in those days. It had just begun to make its appearance in Roman society. I mean, something ain't never changed because this middle class, is disappearing. But here nor there, they're just describing society and, class at a particular time. The first struggles between, I read that. The first struggles between the expanding Roman and Parthian states had been concluded. This is who Rome was pretty much kind of going to war with. The first struggles between the expanding Roman and Parthian states had been concluded in the then recent past, leaving Syria in the hands of the Romans. In the times of Jesus, Palestine and Syria were enjoying a period of prosperity, relative peace, and extensive commercial intercourse with the lands to both the east and the west. Mind you, Jesus knew, just to backtrack a little bit, Michael knew, the whole universe pretty much knew that Michael chose this planet 35,000, well, almost 30-some thousand years before he came down here. It's amazing, I know. But again, they do time different upstairs. Anyway, a lot of things had to take place for this to happen. And they wanted to choose a particular location and, among other things, down to his family, his lineage, everything, spiritual powers that be, mainly Gabriel, were observing this planet and seeing what would be the most favorable way for this mission to take place. And him being born in Palestine, this geographic location that's in the mix, it's pretty much in the mix. It's kind of like, the Atlanta of his day. It had a lot to do with him coming there. 2, the Jewish people. The Jews were a part of the older Semitic race, which also included the Babylonians, the Phoenicians, and the more recent enemies of Rome, the Carthaginians. During the forepart of the 1st century after Christ, the Jews were the most influential group of the Semitic peoples, and they happened to occupy a peculiarly strategic geographic position in the world, as it was at that time ruled and organized for trade. Now, in previous papers, actually, after Melchizedek, they go into what happens pretty much after Melchizedek left and how his message of one God spread throughout the world. And they go into detail with Hebrew history as well as the origin of the Semites. And that's within these papers. And you should definitely check it out for yourself. But in short, the Semitic people were a real mixed up race of people. Had not just, I meant that in a racial sense. They pretty much contain every different race of people within their blood. So a real mixed up people in the mix of everything. Many of the great highways joining the nations of antiquity passed through Palestine. Antiquity is ancient time, which thus became the meeting place or crossroads of 3 continents. The travel, trade, and armies of Babylonia, Assyria, Egypt, Syria, Greece, Parthia, and Rome successively swept over Palestine. From time immemorial, many caravan routes from the Orient passed through some part of this region to the few good seaports of the eastern end of the Mediterranean. I'm going to skip down. Basically, it's just saying, a lot passed through Palestine at that time, and it was like the crossroads of the world in a sense, because it was in the middle of 3 different continents, being Africa, Asia, and Europe. Although Palestine was the home of Jewish religious culture and the birthplace of Christianity, the Jews were abroad in the world, dwelling in many nations and trading in every province of the Roman and Parthian states. Greece provided a language and a culture. Rome built the roads and unified an empire, but the dispersion of the Jews with their more than 200 synagogues and well-organized religious communities scattered hither and yon throughout the Roman world provided the cultural centers in which the new gospel of the kingdom of heaven found initial reception, and from which it subsequently spread to the uttermost parts of the world. And they go on to, talk about how the center of Jewish life was the temple at Jerusalem at that time. Some of these things, I don't know if I'm going to skip over what. The Jewish people of this time, although under Roman, I keep forgetting how to say this word, suzerainty, basically under Roman rule, enjoyed a considerable degree of self-government, and remembering, I ain't gonna read that, but basically they were under Roman rule, but they had a relatively free form of self-government. Like, they kind of operated within a nation, as a nation. The secret of the survival of Palestine, the kingdom of the Jews, as a semi-independent state was wrapped up in the foreign policy of the Roman government, which desired to maintain control of the Palestinian highway of travel between Syria and Egypt. So it was being such a strategic location, they just go on to explain Rome didn't really want no smoke with them about no minor things, just so they could control the roads, because it linked Syria and Egypt. And that was a big deal back then. Let me read this. This is the fortuitous liberty and independence of the political rule of surrounding and more powerful peoples, the Jews attributed to the fact that they were the chosen people, to the direct interposition of Yahweh. Basically, they figured, like, since wasn't nobody touching them and letting them be, even though Rome just wanted the roads, they let them have it, you know what I'm saying? But they attributed that fact to this idea that they're the chosen people. And it starts to allude to their sense of superiority over others. Such an attitude of racial superiority made it all the harder for them to endure Roman suzerainty when it finally fell upon their land. But even in that sad hour, the Jews refused to learn that their world mission was spiritual, not political. It is a lot of foreshadowing wrapped up in that last sentence. The Jews refused to learn that their world mission was spiritual, not political. I'll just leave it there. The Jews were unusually apprehensive and suspicious during the times of Jesus, because they were then ruled by an outsider, Herod the Idumene, who had seized the overlordship of Judea by cleverly ingratiating himself with the Roman rulers. So at this time, when Jesus came down here, the Jews of Judea, which was a nation, so to say, where a lot of the Jews were at, which is modern day Israel, they were ruled by Herod, the first king. This is Herod the Great, I think. Yeah. And they're saying he got into power by cozying up to the Romans. And though Herod professed loyalty to the Hebrew ceremonial observances, he proceeded to build temples for many strange gods. So Herod was like, yeah, I'm with y'all, do your thing, Jews, whatever. Meanwhile, he was building a whole lot of different temples and everything dedicated to other gods. So he really wasn't with them because he wasn't really a Jew. The friendly relations of Herod with the Roman rulers made the world safe for Jewish travel and thus opened the way for increased Jewish penetration, even of distant portions of the Roman Empire and of foreign treaty nations with the new gospel of the kingdom of heaven. Herod's reign also contributed much toward the further blending of Hebrew and Hellenistic philosophies. Hellenistic meaning Greek. Herod built the harbor of Caesarea, which further aided in making Palestine the crossroads of the civilized world. He died in 4 BC, and his son Herod Antipas governed Galilee and Perea during Jesus' youth and ministry to AD 39. Antipas, like his father, was a great builder. He rebuilt many of the cities of Galilee, including the important trade center of Sepphoris. This is interesting right here, because this is foreshadowing. This come into play. The Galileans were not regarded with full favor by the Jerusalem religious leaders and rabbinical teachers. Galilee was more Gentile than Jewish when Jesus was born. Jesus was from Galilee, and a lot of Jews regarded Galilee as not really being as Jewish as they wanted it to be. It was kind of looked down upon, basically, because a lot of Gentiles lived there. And to a Jew, a Gentile is anybody who ain't a Jew. 3, among the Gentiles. Let me see how much I'm. Although the social and economic condition of the Roman state was not of the highest order, the widespread domestic peace and prosperity was propitious for the bestowal of Michael. What does, I don't know, I ain't even, what's propitious? I'm guessing kind of making it able to foster posterity, basically. In the first century after Christ, the society of the Mediterranean world consisted of 5 well-defined strata. Strata meaning like different classes of people. 1, the aristocracy. So what they're saying, just real quick, this is how life was among the Gentiles. And these were anybody who wasn't a Jew at this time in this Mediterranean area, governed by the Roman Empire. And so this is how they were living. You had the aristocracy, the upper classes with money and official power, the privileged and ruling groups. 2, the business groups, the merchant princes and the bankers, the traders, the big importers and exporters, the international merchants. 3, the small middle class. Although this group was indeed small, it was very influential and provided the moral backbone of the early Christian church, which encouraged these groups to continue in their various crafts and trades. 4, the free proletariat. This group had little or no social standing. Though proud of their freedom, they were placed at great disadvantage because they were forced to compete with slave labor. Then this is the 5th class of people under this Roman Empire, the slaves. Half the population of the Roman state was slaves. Many were superior individuals and quickly made their way up among the free proletariat and even among the tradesmen. The majority were either mediocre or very inferior. they pretty much go to talk about how slavery was a feature of Roman military conquest, and some people were able to work their way up through the classes, though. And they pretty much go on to say that in those times, even though this was so divided, they say people were not class conscious, were not as much as we might consider today. All right, this part 4, Gentile philosophy. The Gentiles were, from a moral standpoint, somewhat inferior to the Jews, but there was present in the hearts of the nobler Gentiles abundant soil of natural goodness and potential human affection in which it was possible for the seed of Christianity to sprout and bring forth an abundant harvest of moral character and spiritual achievement. The Gentile world was then dominated by 4 great philosophies, all more or less derived from the earlier Platonism of the Greeks. These schools of philosophy were, so what they're saying, this Gentile world, which is at the time anybody but Jews, and particularly a lot of Greeks or people from the Greco-Roman world, there were 4 prevailing schools of philosophy at the time, and they list them. 1, the Epicurean. This school of thought was dedicated to the pursuit of happiness. It goes on and lists some more. It expounds on them, but I'm just going to read through them. 2, the Stoic. Stoicism was the superior philosophy of the better classes. A lot of you have already heard of Stoicism, the idea of it. 3, the Cynic. Although the Cynic traced their philosophy to Diogenes of Athens, they derived much of their doctrine from the remnants of the teachings of Machiavellian Melchizedek, and they expound some more on cynicism. 4, the Skeptic. Skepticism asserted that knowledge was fallacious and that conviction and assurance were impossible. It was a purely negative attitude and never became widespread. These philosophies were semi-religious. They were often invigorating, ethical, and ennobling, but were usually above the common people. With the possible exception of cynicism, they were philosophies for the strong and the wise, not religions of salvation for even the poor and the weak. 5, the Gentile religions. So this is the religions that were going on back in the day, and I'm just listing pretty much. 1, the Pagan Cults. These were a combination of Hellenic and Latin mythology, patriotism, and tradition. So this is one of the religions at the time of Jesus in this Mediterranean area. A lot of it was pagan cults. And like they say, it was a combination of Hellenic, meaning Greek, and Latin, Roman mythology, patriotism, and tradition, all kind of wrapped up into one, formed a religion for some people at that time. There was 2, emperor worship. This deification of man as the symbol of the state was very seriously resented by the Jews and the early Christians and led directly to the bitter persecutions of both churches by the Roman government. So emperor worship, hail Caesar, like putting Caesar above all, is emperor worship. 3, astrology. Hey, I'm just reading. I know a lot of y'all into this, but this is what they say. This pseudo science of Babylon developed into a religion throughout the Greco-Roman Empire, even in the 20th century. Make that the 21st, because this was written in 1934. Even in the 20th century, man has not been fully delivered from this superstitious belief. 4, the mystery religions. Upon such a spiritually hungry world, a flood of mystery cults had broken, new and strange religions from the Levant, which had enamored the common people and had promised them individual salvation. these religions rapidly became the accepted belief of the lower classes of the Greco-Roman world, and they did much to prepare the way for the rapid spread of the vastly superior Christian teachings, which presented a majestic concept of deity associated with an intriguing theology for the intelligent and a profound proffer of salvation for all, including the ignorant but spiritually hungry average man of those days. So, this fifth religion at the time was several different religions that focus on mystery. And they go on to talk about these mystery religions, so-called mystery teachings. And it's people to this day who, as you'll see, practice this. The mystery religions spelled the end of national beliefs and resulted in the birth of the numerous personal cults. The mysteries were many, but were all characterized by some mythical legend, a mystery, hence their name. As a rule, this mystery pertained to the story of some god's life and death and return to life, as illustrated by the teachings of Mithraism, which for a time were contemporary with and a competitor of Paul's rising cult of Christianity. As one of many different mystery religions at the time, Mithraism, and it originated in Persia, which we know as Iran. The mysteries were non-national and interracial. They were open to all different types of groups of people. They were characterized by elaborate ceremonies of initiation and impressive sacraments of worship. Their secret rites and rituals were sometimes gruesome and revolting. To this day, there are people who initiate themselves into certain religions or identities or societies even where they feel they have this mystery knowledge that don't nobody else possess. But since they went through all these rites and rituals and different types of ceremonies, they got the truth. And they say, but no matter what the nature of their ceremonies or the degree of their excesses, these mysteries invariably promised their devotees salvation. And they go on to pretty much say, don't confuse the teachings of Jesus with no mystery religion. So I'm gonna go down a little bit. Basically, I'm gonna just skip down. Into such a generation of men dominated by such incomplete systems of philosophy and perplexed by such complex cults of religion, Jesus was born in Palestine. And to the same generation, he subsequently gave his gospel of personal religion, sonship with God. Excuse me. Part 6, the Hebrew religion. By the close of the first century before Christ, the religious thought of Jerusalem had been tremendously influenced and somewhat modified by Greek cultural teachings and even by Greek philosophy. In the long contest between the views of the Eastern and Western schools of Hebrew thought, Jerusalem and the rest of the Occident and the Levant in general adopted the Western Jewish or modified Hellenistic viewpoint. What they just said is that the bulk of Jews back then, the majority of them had somewhat of a whitewashed version of Judaism because it's a Hellenistic viewpoint, which means Greek. So they kind of done mixed their religion and sprinkled in a little, teachings and philosophies from the Greeks. In the days of Jesus, the three languages prevailed in Palestine. The common people spoke some dialect of Aramaic, The priests and rabbis spoke Hebrew. The educated classes and the better strata of Jews in general spoke Greek. The early translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek at Alexandria was responsible in no small measure for the subsequent predominance of the Greek wing of Jewish culture and theology. So that's a big deal. The fact that the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek helped that spread into the Occident or Western world. But yeah, I'm gonna skip down. Skip down quite a few paragraphs. This is part 6, the Hebrew religion. Throughout the whole wide world, no matter where the Jews found themselves, dispersed by commerce or oppression, all with one accord kept their hearts centered on the holy temple at Jerusalem. Jewish theology did survive as it was interpreted and practiced at Jerusalem, notwithstanding that it was several times saved from oblivion by the timely intervention of certain Babylonian teachers. As many as 2.5 million of these dispersed Jews used to come to Jerusalem for the celebration of their national religious festivals. And no matter what the theologic or philosophic differences of the Eastern, Babylonian, and the Western Hellenic Jews, they were all agreed on Jerusalem as the center of their worship and in ever looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. So during his day, there was great anticipation on what they viewed, these Jews, as a Messiah. Part 7, Jews and Gentiles. By the times of Jesus, the Jews had arrived at a settled concept of their origin, history, and destiny. They had built up a rigid wall of separation between themselves and the Gentile world. They looked upon all Gentile ways with utter contempt. They worshiped the letter of the law and indulged a form of self-righteousness based upon the false pride of descent. They had formed preconceived notions regarding the promised Messiah, and most of these expectations envisaged a Messiah who would come as a part of their national and racial history. To the Hebrews of those days, Jewish theology was irrevocably settled, forever fixed. So what they just said is the Jews back in the times of Jesus, before he got here, were anticipating a Messiah, like a national and racial deliverer. That's what they were looking for. And it almost political. They were seeking some sort of worldly domination in a sense, based on the fact that they felt they were a chosen people. Now, to a degree, they were chosen because this goes all the way back to Melchizedek picking Abraham and telling him, you're going to have, your seed is going to be as numerous as the stars. And you all, as a people, are meant to carry the truth of one God. But from those times up until the times of Jesus, which was almost 2,000 years, that concept got a little hazy, and they got a little, their idea of who they were as a people took on a different note. And it was more worldly in its perception, in their perception. And that's major because that's where some conflict arises. The teachings and practices of Jesus regarding tolerance and kindness ran counter to the long-standing attitude of the Jews toward other peoples whom they considered heathen. For generations, the Jews had nourished an attitude toward the outside world, which made it impossible for them to accept the Master's teachings about the spiritual brotherhood of man. They were unwilling to share Yahweh on equal terms with the Gentiles and were likewise unwilling to accept as the Son of God one who taught such new and strange doctrines. So yes, The Jews believed in the Lord God of Israel and pretty much nobody else. The scribes, the Pharisees, and the priesthood held the Jews in a terrible bondage of ritualism and legalism, a bondage far more real than that of the Roman political rule. Scribes, writers, the Pharisees, this is kind of like not a priest per se, but I don't know, they're ecclesiastical authority in Judaism. And the priesthood held the Jews in a terrible bondage of ritualism and legalism. They were more concerned about rituals, traditions, and all sorts of things because they're going to point to the book like this is what Moses said. And that was them at that time. The Jews of Jesus' time were not only held in subjugation to the law, but were equally bound by the slavish demands of the traditions, which involved and invaded every domain of personal and social life. These minute regulations of conduct pursued and dominated every loyal Jew, and it is not strange that they promptly rejected one of their number who presumed to ignore their sacred traditions and who dared to flout their long-honored regulations of social conduct. They're just telling you ahead of time what they were thinking as a people, how a lot of them were thinking, per se, as a people, and what made them as a people subsequently reject the master. They could hardly regard with favor the teachings of one who did not hesitate to clash with dogmas which they regarded as having been ordained by Father Abraham himself. Moses had given them their law, and they would not compromise. By the time of the first century after Christ, the spoken interpretation of the law by the recognized teachers, the scribes, had become a higher authority than the written law itself. That's a trip. It's like, man. So they have a lot of different writings, man, and people who have subsequently just kind of like came up with their own theories. And that became more important at the time than the law itself, which Moses gave them. And all this made it easier for certain religious leaders of the Jews to array the people against the acceptance of a new gospel. These circumstances rendered it impossible for the Jews to fulfill their divine destiny as messengers of the new gospel of religious freedom and spiritual liberty. They could not break the fetters of tradition. Jeremiah had told of the law to be written in men's heart. Ezekiel has spoken of a new spirit to live in man's soul. And the psalmist had prayed that God would create a clean heart within and renew a right spirit. But when the Jewish religion of good works and slavery to law fell victim to the stagnation of traditionalistic inertia, the motion of religious evolution passed westward to the European peoples. They pretty much just telling you how they kind of lost their right to, they failed in their mission in a sense. Like these are the people that they had picked a long time ago. Like somebody had to be here to receive Jesus. So Melchizedek came here, pulled Abraham to the side, told him start a people based on what I'm telling you. This one truth. He started a people. Something really came from that. And eventually though, even after all the prophets from starting with Samuel all the way through, they just kind of lost sight of their mission, so to say. And that caused it, while they lost sight of that, the Greeks or a lot of people, Roman citizens even at the time were like, damn, I did what I just heard, when it came to what they heard about the teachings of Jesus. And they ran with it. That's all they're saying. And took it west. Even though, and this is something we'll get into, and they really go in detail about it. And they've already started. What Paul did and started this Christianity as we know it is not the raw life and teachings of Jesus. It's something else. It's morphed into something else. Of course, it's based on his life, but is not the raw, pure, uncut by any means, as we about to see. And so different people were called upon to carry an advancing theology to the world, a system of teaching embodying the philosophy of the Greeks, the law of the Romans, the morality of the Hebrews, and the gospel of personality, sanctity, and spiritual liberty, formulated by Paul and based on the teachings of Jesus. So that's a whole lot of cut already, but that's what they were working with back then. I'm gonna skip down a little bit. I'm gonna go on. I think I'm gonna go to part 8. Previous written records. Now this is interesting. Mind you, if you believe this, okay, I think this is true. And all that to say, if you believe this, what they're telling you, you gotta understand these authors who are celestial beings of varying orders. This particular author of this whole, the one who put this together, was a midwayer. And as I mentioned, they're very close to human beings. They're in between an angel and humans. So let them tell it this was a midwayer attached to Andrew, the chief apostle, so to say. He's the one that was like the manager of the crew. And all that to say, they have a different point of view. They have a very, if you believe this and what they say makes sense, I'll never in life encounter a person who could say anything as complete and comprehensive as well as consistent like these people, like these beings portray about spiritual matters and spiritual history. So I don't think a man made this up. I think this is just what they're saying. I think they are who they say they are. And all that to say, they have a different point of view, a very in-depth point of view. They can relay things as it actually happened. You know what I'm saying? So what they're about to do is tell you how the gospels that we know of, like the only thing we really know about, most people know about Jesus comes from the so-called gospels in the Bible, and they're about to tell you how these came to pass. So this is 8 previous written records. As far as possible, consistent with our mandate, we have endeavored to utilize and to some extent coordinate the existing records having to do with the life of Jesus on Urantia. Although we have enjoyed access to the lost record of the Apostle Andrew and have benefited from the collaboration of a vast host of celestial beings who were on earth during the times of Michael's bestowal, notably his now personalized adjuster, it has been our purpose also to make use of the so-called Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, this midwayer is saying, as far as possible, they had access. Evidently, Andrew wrote down a bunch of records. Like, he kept some notes, but he knew that the master didn't really want him doing that or publishing them or anything, so he really kept it to himself for a long time. But he had some sort of a record. And not only that, he's saying they collaborated with, they talked to a bunch of other celestial beings who are on the planet at the time and got the rundown. They heard their versions of, what they witnessed. Celestial beings. This is how they gathered all this information to bring us this detail that we've never heard in life before. And not only that, they still pulled from as much as they could, they still dealt with the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they finna tell you how these New Testament records had their origin in the following circumstances. 1, the Gospel by Mark. John Mark wrote the earliest, accepting the notes of Andrew. That was in parentheses. John Mark wrote the earliest, briefest, and most simple record of Jesus' life. He presented the Master as a minister, as man among men. Although Mark was a lad lingering about many of the scenes which he depicts, his record is in reality the gospel according to Simon Peter. He was earlier associated with Peter, later with Paul. So John Mark, just to give you a little heads up, he was a youth, and he used to hang around Jesus and the apostles at the height of their ministry. And he wrote a little simple record of Jesus's life. And in addition to that, though, it really came from Peter. Now, you've heard of Peter, most likely. I would think Simon Peter. And he was associated early after Jesus had left with Peter and then subsequently with Paul. Mark wrote this record at the instigation of Peter and on the earnest petition of the Church of Rome. Knowing how consistently the Master refused to write out his teachings when on earth and in the flesh, Mark, like the apostles and other leading disciples, was hesitant to put them in writing. See, man, I know I've sat back and watched so many people. I ain't gonna keep going off on these tangents, but it's relevant. I done sat back and watched so many people. Well, why this? Why that? He existed. Why this? Why that? Where the tomb? Where the body at? Like, just all kind of stuff. And I get it. You know what I'm saying? I get it. There's a lot of mystery. I don't think I've ever just been dismissive of it. Like, I figured something happened. I figured there was some sort of person to cause all this. That's my take. But all that to say, if you worried about why it ain't no just clear-cut written record, it's because from the get-go, he was told, don't leave no writings behind. And evidently, he told that to the apostles and close disciples. Like, if you really rock with him, you knew that. Knowing how consistently the Master refused to write out his teachings when on earth and in the flesh, Mark, like the apostles and other leading disciples, was hesitant to put them in writing. But Peter felt the church at Rome required the assistance of such a written narrative, and Mark consented to undertake its preparation. He made many notes before Peter died in AD 67, and in accordance with the outline approved by Peter and for the church at Rome, he began his writing soon after Peter's death. The gospel was completed near the end of AD 68. Mark wrote entirely from his own memory and Peter's memory. The record has since been considerably changed. Numerous passages have been taken out and some later matter added at the end to replace the latter 1/5 of the original gospel, which was lost from the first manuscript before it was ever copied. This record by Mark, in conjunction with Andrew's and Matthew's notes, was the written basis of all subsequent gospel narratives which sought to portray the life and teachings of Jesus. So they just told you how the gospel by Mark came about. 2, the Gospel of Matthew. The so-called gospel, according to Matthew, is the record of the Master's life which was written for the edification of Jewish Christians. The author of this record constantly seeks to show in Jesus' life that which he did was that, quote, it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. Matthew's gospel portrays Jesus as a son of David, picturing him as showing great respect for the law and the prophets. Now that's a big deal because some of this, what they just said, The Gospel of Matthew was painted a picture in a way it was meant for Jewish Christians, so to say, Jews who are still practicing, traditions and rituals, but still, felt the master's teaching, so to say. So the Gospel of Matthew presented Jesus in such a way that was favorable to Jewish Christians at the time. The Apostle Matthew did not write this gospel. It was written by Isidore, one of his disciples, who had as a help in his work not only Matthew's personal remembrance of these events, but also a certain record which the latter had made of the sayings of Jesus directly after the crucifixion. So yeah, the Gospel of Matthew was written by like one of his pupils, this Isidore, a disciple of Matthew's, and it was based on events that Matthew, as he described them. And this happened, he did this after the crucifixion. This record by Matthew was written in Aramaic. Isidore wrote in Greek. There was no intent to deceive in accrediting the production to Matthew. It was the custom in those days for pupils thus to honor their teachers. Matthew's original record was edited and added in AD 40 just before he left Jerusalem to engage in evangelistic preaching. It was a private record, the last copy having been destroyed in the burning of a Syrian monastery in AD 416. I'm going to skip down a little bit. The Gospel by Luke. Luke, the physician of Antioch in Pisidia, was a Gentile convert of Paul, and he wrote quite a different story of the master's life. He began to follow Paul and learn of the life and teachings of Jesus in AD 47. Luke preserves much of the, quote, grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, end quote, in his record as he gathered up these facts from Paul and others. Luke presents the master as, quote, the friend of publicans and sinners. He did not formulate his many notes into the gospel until after Paul's death. Now, mind you, Paul didn't run with them. If you don't know, like, Paul came on the scene after the fact. Jesus had already left his planet, but he became a major convert, and his interpretation of Christ's life is the basis for what we know as modern day Christianity. And again, Christianity and the life and teachings of Jesus are two different things. Let me skip down. He did not formulate his many notes into the gospel until after Paul's death. This is Luke. Now, Luke wrote in the year 82 in Achaia. He planned 3 books dealing with the history of Christ and Christianity, but died in AD 90 just before he finished the second of these works, the Acts of the Apostles. So that was written by Luke. As material for the compilation of his gospel, Luke first depended upon the story of Jesus' life as Paul had related it to him. Mind you, again, Paul didn't even run with them. Luke's gospel is therefore in some ways the gospel according to Paul, but Luke had other sources of information. He not only interviewed scores of eyewitnesses to the numerous episodes of Jesus's life which he records, but he also had with him a copy of Mark's gospel, that is the first four fifths, Isidore's narrative, and a brief record made in the year AD 78 at Antioch by a believer named Scribes. Luke also had a mutilated and much edited copy of some notes purported to have been made by the Apostle Andrew. So Luke compiled as much as he could together to get this story, as according to him, about Christ. 4. The Gospel of John. The Gospel, according to John, relates much of Jesus' work in Judea and around Jerusalem, which is not contained in the other records. This is the so-called gospel according to John, the son of Zebedee. And though John did not write it, he did inspire it. Since his first writing, it has several times been edited to make it appear to have written by John himself. When his record was made, John had the other Gospels and he saw that much had been omitted. Accordingly, in the year AD 101, now John ran with Jesus. He was the youngest of the apostles. And so he lived up until at least AD 101. So what they're saying, he finally got around to writing this, since he saw a lot had been left out. So accordingly, in the year AD 101, he encouraged his associate Nathan, a Greek Jew from Caesarea, to begin the writing. John supplied his material from memory and by reference to the 3 records already in existence. He had no written records of his own. The epistle known as 1 John was written by John himself as a covering letter for the work which Nathan executed under his direction. All these writers presented honest pictures of Jesus as they saw, remembered, or had learned of him, and as their concepts of these distant events were affected by the subsequent espousal of Paul's theology and of Christianity. And these records, imperfect as they are, have been sufficient to change the course of the history of Urantia for almost 2,000 years. I think you got to acknowledge that. Whatever you may think of the Bible, these 4 altered, adulterated books with things left out, things added, people's shady memories and all that, is still has changed the world. You can't lie about that. Now, they given it an acknowledgement, and this is about to be the end of this particular episode. So this would be the midwayer attached to Andrew. Got a little something to say at the end. Acknowledgement. I'm not sure if I'm gonna read all this, it's a lot, but in carrying out my commission to restate the teachings and retell the doings of Jesus of Nazareth, I have drawn freely upon all sources of record and planetary information. My ruling motive has been to prepare a record which will not only be enlightening to the generation of men now living, but which may also be helpful to all future generations. From the vast store of information made available to me, I have chosen that which is best suited to the accomplishment of this purpose. As far as possible, I have derived my information from purely human sources. Only when such sources fail have I resorted to those records which are superhuman. When ideas and concepts of Jesus' life and teachings have been acceptably expressed by a human mind, I invariably gave preference to such apparently human thought patterns. Yo, listen to this. Although I have sought to adjust the verbal expression the better to conform to our concept of the real meaning and the true import of the Master's life and teachings as far as possible, I have adhered to the actual human concept and thought pattern in all my narratives. This midway is saying, I'm going to try to tell this as best I can from other humans' viewpoints to you, other human beings, so you'll understand it more. And if these human beings fail to, like, their thought pattern just kind of failed to really register what was happening, only then do I resort to superhuman sources. I have adhered to the actual human concept and thought pattern, and I well know that those concepts which have had origin in the human mind will prove more acceptable and helpful to all other human minds. When unable to find the necessary concepts in the human records or in human expressions, I have next resorted to the memory resources of my own order of earth creatures. So, he's starting off from the lowest to the high. If you don't have no humans who can express a concept or relay something about this narrative, whether it be some backstory, an event, something that actually happened. If no human was witnessing it, then I resort to my order of being midwayers, and I try to get it from them. When unable to find the necessary concepts in the human records or in human expressions, I have next resorted to the memory resources of my own order of earth creatures, the midwayers. And when that secondary source of information proved inadequate, I have unhesitatingly resorted to the superplanetary sources of information. The memoranda which I have collected and from which I have prepared this narrative of the life and teachings of Jesus, aside from the memory of the record of the Apostle Andrew, embrace thought gems and superior concepts of Jesus' teachings assembled from more than 2,000 human beings who have lived on earth from the days of Jesus down to the time of the inditing of these revelations, more correctly, restatements. The revelatory permission has been utilized only when a human record and human concepts fail to supply an adequate thought pattern. My revelatory commission forbade me to resort to extra human sources of either information or expression until such a time as I could testify that I had failed in my efforts to find the required conceptual expression in purely human sources. While I, with the collaboration of my 11 associate fellow midwayers and under the supervision of the Melchizedek of record, have portrayed this narrative in accordance with my concept of its effective arrangement and in response to my choice of immediate expression, nevertheless, the majority of the ideas and even some of the effective expressions which I have thus utilized had their origin in the minds of the men of many races who have lived on earth during the intervening generations, right on down to those who are still alive at the time of this undertaking. In many ways, I have served more as a collector and editor than as an original narrator. I have unhesitatingly appropriated those ideas and concepts, preferably human, which would enable me to create the most effective portraiture of Jesus' life, and which would qualify me to restate his matchless teachings in the most strikingly helpful and universally uplifting phraseology. He's like, man, I'm just trying to serve y'all the best I can in a way that you're going to understand and it's going to hit home the most. I'm going to put it best I can in some words you're going to understand. In behalf of the Brotherhood of the United Midwayers of Urantia, I most gratefully acknowledge our indebtedness to all sources of record and concept which have been hereinafter utilized in the further elaboration of our restatement of Jesus' life on earth. That was the end of paper 121, the times of Michael's bestowal, the world Jesus was born into. Just setting the stage. Next is going to be birth and infancy of Jesus.